We're here today at the site of es-Safi, biblical Gath of the Philistines, with Dr. Aren Maeir, who's actually excavated here for about a quarter of a century, correct?
Even more, close to 30 years.
A long time. So anyways, we're here today to talk about your recent article that's coming out in Bar on the Philistines. So let me ask you the hard-hitting journalism question first. Were the Philistines actually giants?
No.
Okay. Now that we got that out of the way, let's dig into the Philistines a little bit more. So before we start on your kind of view of the Philistines, can you give me a little bit of an idea of what is the traditional view of the Philistines?
Okay. Around 1200 BC, that's the transition between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. It's a much longer process. That's for even 200 years, but let's say 1200 is a good point. And there's a big transition in the entire Eastern and even Central Mediterranean from the late Bronze Age world order into what slowly becomes the Iron Age world order. This includes the collapse of the Mycenaean palace, political entities, the collapse of the Hittite Empire, the slow weakening of the Egyptian Empire, and they're losing control of Canaan. And it also includes the arrival in the Eastern Mediterranean of all kinds of new groups. Best known, perhaps, are the Israelites, we'll hear about then, the Arameans, the Ammonites, the Edomites, etc., and also the Philistines and what we call in modern terminology, the Sea Peoples. And in the past, for example, when I was an archaeology student, it was explained that the Philistines are basically groups, or a group, who migrated from more or less the region of Mycenaean Greece to the southern Levant, captured the coastal plain, the southern coastal plain, what we call in biblical geography Philistia, which would be in modern terms between the Yarkon River and the Gaza Strip along the coast. Mm-hmm. And they conquered the Canaanite cities and settled with a new non-local material culture, which over the Iron Age, over a period of some 600 years, slowly became more and more like the local population, okay, the local cultures. Now, one of the things that's come out, both from the excavations at es-Safi and from excavations that have been conducted in Philistia and in adjoining areas over the last few decades, is that the picture is more complicated than that. And that even though there is no doubt that some parts of the Philistines were in fact from the Aegean, there's other components as well. And we see that it's not that when the Philistine culture appears, it's a 100% transferal of what they had in culture in the Mycenaean region and they brought it here. Mm-hmm. But there are some Mycenaean stuff and Cypriot stuff and Anatolian stuff and other areas. But even more importantly, there's also the continuation of some local aspects. So what I like to think now, and I think more and more scholars are looking in this direction, is that the Philistine culture is basically not even a Greek salad, but a Mediterranean salad. Mm. And it's all kinds of people who came together. Perhaps might be that the Aegean component were maybe the elites. That could be, but that's not even sure. But when all these different groups come together, this is what forms the Philistine culture. And this is the identity that, if you talk about in the biblical text and in other texts, when they talk about Philistines, it's probably not someone who came from, but it's the people here who formed into some group with this identity. Okay,
and you mentioned other texts, so let's quickly detour into that. I know in the Egyptian material, when they talk about the Sea People, they have like the palace set, who are traditionally viewed as the proto-Philistines. Is that still a theory that's tenable, or?
Well, there are a few Egyptian texts which mention various groups who, in modern terminology, we call the Sea Peoples. That's not an Egyptian term. And among them is, particularly in the reliefs of the pharaoh Ramses III in the beginning of the 12th century BCE, when he describes his battle against these groups, one of the groups is the Egyptians write Periset, which is something of the sort, because they didn't have an L. And it's accepted that that's a rendition of Peleset Philistine.
Okay.
So that probably is one of the groups that's mentioned, and that is maybe that's either directly the Philistines already, or maybe one of the components that eventually becomes what we call the Philistines. But I think that identity is quite clear, and there are other groups as well, the Chardonu and the Jekers and others, which we have a little harder time identifying. But materially, but there are also other groups there, and there's no question that there was a lot going on.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we are here in biblical Gath of the Philistines, which is kind of about in the middle of all of this, what we would call Philistia. But how many Philistine cities were there? Is Gath here unique amongst them? Is there anything special about it, or is it just that it's been so well excavated?
Okay. Well, first of all, the Bible tells us of 5 major Philistine cities, the so-called Philistine Pentapolis, the 5 cities, which is along the coast, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza, and inland Ekron, which is about 9 kilometers to the north of us, and Gath, and after close to a century of debates of where Philistine Gath is, I think it's accepted that es-Safi, in fact, is the location. I think that's without a doubt. And of those 5 cities, 4 have been archaeologically excavated: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. Gaza has been excavated, but not for archaeological purposes. A lot of tunnels and things like that. But so we know quite a lot about the 4 Philistine cities that I mentioned before, and we get from it a picture of late Bronze Age sites. That's somewhere around 1200. A new culture appears. The Philistine culture. We now know how to talk about the definitions of the attributes of this culture. Changes in pottery, changes in subsistence, changes in architecture, and things like that. And we have in it we have enough information now to be able to say we can identify what a Philistine is. Now, besides those 4 Philistine cities, over the years, quite a few other sites have been excavated that have Philistine finds in them. Whether it's in Tel Aviv, you have the Tel Kasila temples, which probably are Philistine temples. We have sites as Tel Afara South, where we have tombs with Philistine material. You have a small Philistine temple that was excavated at a site called Nahal Patish about 15 years ago, and there's a whole bunch of other sites which fill in the the picture besides the major sites.
So what is a Philistine?
Well, first of all, the more I learn about the Philistine, the more that question becomes problematic. And I would say that I would perhaps prefer that a Philistine is someone who lived in Iron Age Philistia. Why am I saying this? Because the clear-cut definition of, you use Philistine pottery and you eat pig, which was one thought that's the definition of a Philistine, it's much more complex, because we have sites in Philistia where they did eat pig or they didn't eat pig, or at times yes and at times no. There are sites that they use Philistine pottery, very clearly, and sites where it's less clear. And I think the question of who is a Philistine is a great example of the complexity of the connecting identity with archaeological remains, and the supposition that we could make a very straightforward, simplistic, one-on-one identification of a Philistine, or for that fact, an Israelite or an Aramean. When you start going into the details, it's much more complex. Why? Because, as someone once said, identity is not a thing, it's a process. And so all groups and all peoples are constantly in flux. And what you were 100 years ago is not the same that you are now. And not only that, everybody has 5, 10 identities of who they are, which can overlap differently with different people in different groups.
Okay.
So it makes it complex. Now, that said, to not be too nihilistic and make it too difficult for the the person reading about the Philistines, there are a whole set of material attributes which we find at the Philistine site, and that's in the Iron Age one. We have the decorated Philistine pottery with 3 very distinct phases: the Philistine 1, Philistine 2, Philistine 3, which show us the development of the Philistine pottery. We do have changes in the dietary patterns of the Philistines, and a lot of the Philistines ate pig, while a lot of the Israelites, Judahites didn't. But again, you can't say just because of that.
It's not so clear cut.
And you have different types of cultic practice. You have different types of architecture, and a whole set of other things. Now, I would say that when you're at a site, which, based on the written sources, is a Philistine site, and you see all these attributes of the Philistine material culture, then you could say, okay, Gath is Philistine, Ashkelon is Philistine, Ashdod is Islam. But for example, 20 kilometers to the south of us, there's the site of Tel Arni, which, by the way, was once identified as Gath. And they, a few years ago, they excavated a cemetery there dating to the late 11th, early 10th century. And it's not clear whether that is a Philistine or not Philistine. Were those people affiliated with the Philistines? Because it wasn't, the finds are not clear-cut enough.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of the finds, what do we have here at Gath that really jumps out as this is Philistine?
Okay. So one of the interesting issues with Tel es-Safi as Gath of the Philistines is that the name does not retain any remnant of the name Gath. So that's why, and there isn't any other site in this region that retains the name. So that's why so many sites over the years were identified as Gath. And once we started the excavations, we could show that, as, for example, Anson Rainey, the late Anson Rainey, argued that when you analyze the text, this is the place that makes most sense. When we started excavating here, we found everything we should have if this is Philistine Gath, and we didn't find everything we shouldn't find if this was Philistine Gath. And the best example is that we have a very impressive presence of the Philistines from the very beginning of the Iron Age 1, somewhere around 1200, until the late 9th century, when the site is besieged and destroyed completely by Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus, an event mentioned in 2 Kings 12:18 in the Masoretic text, and after that, the site is not a Philistine city anymore, and this fits in with the textual references to Gath, that after the conquest by Hazael, it doesn't figure into the picture. So, for example, when in the late 7th century, Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, captures the other Philistine cities, Gath is not in the picture anymore. And so this fits in very well with a very large and dominant Philistine site with all what we expect to have of a Philistine city. Comes the 9th century, let's say, 830 destruction. It's not there anymore, and that fits in very well with what we know from the textual sources on Philistine Gath.
Okay. Now, if you don't mind, can we dig in a little bit more onto the archaeology of Gath specifically? So I know that you guys have found a lot of really cool things here. Obviously, been digging for a long time, including you found walls, you found huge parts of the domestic quarter of the city, and you found temples and cultic areas. So I'm curious, looking at especially like the cultic stuff, what do we learn about Philistine once again culture religiously that kind of sets it apart?
So first of all, just for a sort of the topography of this site, we're now standing in the lower city.
Yep.
And above us is the upper city. The upper city was settled in almost all periods when es-Safi was settled, and only in the Iron Age, in the Philistine city, this large, flat, lower city was settled. And one of the advantages to that is that after the destruction by Hazael, this area was never resettled. So the Iron Age lower city is right at surface. So now, in our excavations, as you said, we found all kinds of things: domestic areas, production areas, fortifications, temples, etc. And we have so far found 3 cultic buildings. Let's call them temples for the sake of. One was on the eastern side of the Upper Tell. One is right behind over there in the lower city, area D. And another one was found off-site to the east of the site. And each one is different. They're all from the late Iron 1 to the Iron 2A, the destruction by Hazael, and they're very different in character. So, for example, the one on the Tell is a small little building with 2 pillars, like the story of Samson knocking the pillars of Gaza. This one over here is a structure. You can't see anything of it. It's completely covered over. It's a structure which is actually somewhat similar to an Israelite 4-room house.
Okay.
It has buildings around it, and it has a large metal production facility right next to it. And it's right next to the gate, which you see over here, down there, one of the gates, probably the water gate that leads to the other side. There is a water well. And then the third temple is off-site, and as far as its plan, very poorly preserved, but its plan seems to be reminiscent of a Canaanite-type temple. So even just by the architecture, it's diverse. Now, when we look at for example, the best preserved temple, the temple over here, on the one hand, we have cultic aspects which are very reminiscent of Aegean cultic traditions, both in the objects, and very recently we published the botanical remains from this temple, which show a very interesting culture connection with the Aegean cultic traditions. And for example, we found in the charred botanical remains a whole bunch of chase tree fruits, which is a fruit which is in the Aegean. The largest amount of them are found in the temples in the Temple of Hera. So it might indicate that there is some joint tradition here to the ritual of some goddess. So again, when we look at the temples and the cult, we have some things which are clearly non-local, bringing in new cultic traditions, and some things that are clearly very local.
Now, with all of this, we also have the biblical text, which tells us a lot of stuff. One of the things that stands out the most is that the Philistines are often kind of viewed in the biblical tradition as the arch enemies of Israel. Archaeologically speaking, what do we know about the relationship between Israel and Judah and Philistine?
Okay, well, so I think while very often we look at the relations between the Philistines and Israelites in the biblical text mainly as enemies, if you look closer, for example, in the stories relating to Samson, it's on the one hand they fight, and he's kills Philistines, and in the end killed by the Philistines, but he also marries Philistines, and he's back and forth. So I think that, to a certain extent, is what we can see. And we can see both archaeologically and as seen in the textual references that the Philistines were probably enemies and competitors on resources with the Israelites and the Judites, but on the other hand, they interacted. So we have Philistine objects and traditions going eastwards and found in Jerusalem, at Moza, and in other sites. And in Philistia, we have objects of central highland regions, Judean, let's say Judite finds in at the Philistine sites. And for example, at the temple over here, right next to the main altar of the temple, we found a jar which was produced in the Jerusalem area with a little inscription on it with apparently Judite name, which is apparently given to the temple. So that means that, you know, I like saying it's, to a certain extent, it's like the Israelis and the Palestinians today. You know, officially we're enemies, but we have daily interactions. We eat the same food, we tell similar jokes, we work together, etc. And even though there's a wall and a fence between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, people go back and forth, you know, for all kinds of reasons throughout their life.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then let's take a quick step back to kind of sum up, if we can. So the Philistines were possibly part of the sea people who came from, parts of them maybe came from the Aegean, possibly people amongst the Philistines from Anatolia, Cyprus, other regions. They come here to what we know of as Philistia, and they conquer? How did it go from being what we commonly would think of as a Canaanite culture in the Bronze Age to all of a sudden being Philistia? Okay,
well, first of all, the transition between the Late Bronze and the Iron Age was a time of turmoil. All kinds of things changes, and for example, the Egyptian control weakens. New groups appear. There is a period of a drought and perhaps problems of subsistence. So new groups are appearing. New groups can bring with them new methods of fighting, new social organization, etc. So I have a feeling that all these different groups that came to these sites may have come to the previously Canaanite cities in Philistia, and we don't have evidence of a conquest and burning of the cities or anything of the sort, but they may have come and they slowly may have taken over, and maybe the elites who came took over from the Canaanite elites, but they didn't destroy the sites and kill all the Canaanite inhabitants and replace them. It seems that some of the Canaanite inhabitants continued to live there, and in various aspects of the Philistine culture, we have continuity of various Canaanite behaviors. So it's something's continuing.
Okay.
Now, what probably happened is these groups that came together coalesced into something new. Mm-hmm. A culture is never, de novo. It's never, a fresh, pure thing. It's always a combination of different things, and that's what happened to the Philistines.
Okay, and then I know we've been talking about Philistia and Gath and all these places, but outside of the biblical text, would the people of Philistia themselves have thought about themselves in a monoculture sense? Would they have thought of Philistia, or would they have said, "Oh, I'm Gathite, I'm Ekronite"? Well, what was the dynamic there?
We don't have enough Philistine texts to really tell that clearly, but I can say that in antiquity and even till today, people's main identity is their local identity. Okay. That's their most important identity. And for example, when we do have after the Iron Age from Mesopotamia Mesopotamian texts that mention people from Philistia, they're called the person of Gaza or the person of Ashkelon or something like that. And and when very often when the biblical text refers to for example Ittai the Gittite, he doesn't call him Ittai the Philistine. So I have a feeling their identity was very much connected to the place they came from.
And like we see in kind of Greece, Philistia would have been more of a city-state system, right?
Well, I think so. I think you had perhaps 5 major cities, and they vied for importance, and there was probably a seesaw relationship between one time up, one time down, and I think that was probably the format of the political organization that we had in Philistia in the Iron Age.
Okay, when does all of this kind of come to an end? I know we talk about the Judean exile with Nebuchadnezzar, and we kind of use that as a breaking point of the classical Judahite people's tradition. They come back later, but we often view that as a break point in the culture, so to speak. Did Philistia go through something similar? Did it continue? When did it stop? Or what's the idea there?
Gath is destroyed around 830 by the Hazael of Aram. The other Philistine cities apparently continue to exist till the end of the 7th century, when the Babylonians conquered the region, and when the Philistine cities revolted against the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar came in 604, 603, and conquered all the Philistine cities. He apparently destroyed them completely, and whoever was not killed was exiled. And basically, with that, the Philistine culture as a entity that can be clearly defined ended. We have a few texts from Mesopotamia which tell us of peoples originating from that, but we don't have anything else. And as opposed to the Israelites or the Judites, who retained their social identity. And when the Persian took over, they were allowed to return to Judah, and some of the Judites may have even remained in Judah. It never happened in Philistia, and basically the Philistines as a people, like many other peoples throughout history, throughout the world, basically disappeared. That, of course, raises the question: what's the connection between the Philistines and the term for the land, Palestine? And that's where there is some continuity, because what happened during the Iron Age, when this region was the region where the Philistines lived in, the Greeks who came here as traders, as mercenaries, named this region something like Philistia. And then even after the Philistines didn't exist, that region was still called Philistia by the Greeks. And then subsequent to the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans in 132 to 135, when the Romans managed to beat the revolt, and one of the punishments of the Romans towards the Jews was to rename the land from Judea to Palestina. And that's why, from that time onwards, anybody living in the land of Israel was someone who lived in Palestine. So it's a retention of a geographical term, and not the continuation of an ethnic, national, cultural group. And now I know we're running short on time, so just a couple real quick fire questions. What has been one of your favorite things that you've uncovered here at Gath? Well, I think one of the most dramatic things that we've uncovered all over the site are the remains of the destruction of the city by Hazael in 830, and wherever we excavated, we find houses that were burnt down, collapsed, with hundreds and hundreds of finds. In some cases, even the remains of the people who were killed in the finds in the destruction. And what's so nice, archaeologists love working in destruction. Their problem, our joy, is that things were very well preserved. And it gave us a very nice idea of what life was right at that moment when the city was destroyed. And in fact, this destruction gave us really the first time we have a robust understanding of what Philistia during the 9th century was.
And then, having excavated here for 30 years, like you said, you were as the excavation director, or one of the excavation directors, that basically makes you king of Gath.
Yeah. Some people have said I should be called Achish, king of Gath. Well, first of all, when I first came here, I thought I'd work here for 10 years and then go on to other sites. And as time went by, the excavation expanded, the finds became great, new questions, popped up. So basically this is my career excavation, and I don't, I'm not sorry for myself at all. I think it was a great choice.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating site, and I, to a certain extent, I feel like I've turned into a local.
Yeah. But now after 30 30 years, you're done excavating here, you're wrapping things up, you're preparing for all of your many publications that are sure to come, that I'm sure are going to have a very big, profound impact on the study of the Philistines, the study of this region going forward. So I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
And for sharing your knowledge. And for you listening at home, go check out the fall issue of Biblical Archaeology Review. Read Aren's wonderful article where he goes more into depth on some things, less into depth on other things. And as always, thank you for joining us.
And check out the excavation blog that has a lot of information,
yes,
ongoing entries, and you can learn more and more, both serious and not serious things about the excavation.
What's where can we find that?
At Gath WordPress, gath.wordpress.com.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, great talking to you.
You too. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and sign up for our digital newsletter so that you can stay up to date on everything from the world of biblical archaeology. And if you would like to see more, why not check out one of the videos on your screen right now?